Today's daf we're going to be learning is Menachot daf Kaf Aleph. Today's daf is sponsored by Atara Blicker for Refuah Shlema for Ozer Peretz Ben Chana. Okay, we're going to get started with, I want to correct one thing from Friday, so 2 dapim ago. I just want to show the picture again of the temple, and I want to show you one correction that I wasn't clear about. Okay. When I said, okay, let's go back and I'll go back to drawing a little bit. So when you walk out of, if you remember, we had this whole question of which corner do you do the hagasha, okay, where you basically bring the mincha to. And we said it had to be both Pnei Hashem, where you walk out of the Heichal and you get there. And it also had to be on the south side, right? That would make the west side. And then also had to be Al Pnei HaMizbeach, sorry, Lifnei Hashem was the right, did I say the right word? Lifnei Hashem, before God. And the other one, which basically means you could see it from the Heichal. And the other is it had to be on the south side because you had to be Al Pnei HaMizbeach. Now, where the Mizbeach was located, I made one mistake. So let's go to Rabbi Eliezer, who we said the whole Mizbeach is in the north. That we explained correctly. If you move the whole Mizbeach to the north, then basically this south side is going to end up opposite exactly where this arrow is. Right when you walk out of the Heichal, you're going to be looking at the entire south side, and you could basically do it anywhere on the south side, in the southwest corner, or anywhere on the south side, because that you will be facing God, okay, where the Heichal is. That works. But the other opinion actually, when it said specifically it has to be, okay, let me change my color. It has to be specifically in the southwest corner, right here. Why does it have to be specifically there? Because actually the altar is where the picture shows it is. Okay, now according to this, when you're in the Heichal, what can you see of the Mizbeach? You can see the whole west side, okay, including the corner. The southwest corner is the only part of the south that you can see when you're standing there, because theoretically, right, you have angled vision. So you can actually see all the way to the corner there, okay? So only can you do it in the corner, because even though you could see the whole west side, but that's not considered south. You need south because of El Pnei HaMizbeach. So the only place you could do it is in that corner. And that's so the only thing I didn't get right was the fact that you can see it when you angle on an angle, you can see it. So actually the Mizbeach is where it is here, which is basically half on the south, half on the north, but you can, and the corner is not exactly opposite the Heichal, but it can be viewed, the entrance to the Heichal can be viewed on an angle, but then not from anywhere on the south side, because this whole area that I wrote in black here can't be viewed from there, because you don't have vision of Lifnei Hashem over there. You can only have it at that corner. Okay, so that was just to clarify something from last class or 2 classes ago. It's always the problem when you make a mistake on Friday till I fix it on Sunday. Okay, now we're going to go back. We're in the middle of this braita. Why did we bring this braita? So we have to remember. We were talking about the issue of salting. And then we said, if we go back, why did we get into salting? Because Rav said every time it repeats it, it's lakev. And if it doesn't repeat it, then it's not essential. But wait, salting is essential. And right, so now salting, we're going to say salting is essential and it's not repeated. So then the Gemara says, well, what do you mean it's not repeated? It is repeated in this pasuk. And we quote this pasuk and then say, oh no, that's needed for a different drasha. And we go off on this long braita. Okay, which in a nutshell, the braita basically, or maybe I shouldn't say in a nutshell because we really need to understand the different sections. We started with the word mincha comes to exclude blood and wood. Okay, the second section said, well, the word me'al minchatcha comes to exclude blood. Okay, now didn't we exclude blood in the first section, right? So what did we say yesterday? We said, well, first of all, wood is a bit of a problem because the braita says wood, the braita says in the beginning, you would have thought wood and blood would need to be salted because they're called korban. Now, who says that? Rebbi says that. Well, Rebbi is the one who says, and Rebbi must be the author of this braita. The problem is that it says wood doesn't need to be salted. And Rebbi himself says that wood does need to be salted. So then we get really confused and we say, okay, we must have to take out wood. Okay. Once we take out wood, though, that's where we ended in yesterday's daf, we have a problem, because if we take out wood, then the first section of the braita is basically excluding blood from the word mincha. And the second part of the braita is saying for the words me'al minchatcha, further in the pasuk, it's excluding blood. So that really makes no sense. If we exclude blood in the first section, we don't need to exclude blood in the second section. seems like what the braita was doing was it was excluding something in the first section, perhaps blood also. But then the Gemara says, no, no, no. The word mincha excludes something, which at first we thought it was wood. Blood, in the end, they said, well, blood is kind of more similar to a mincha because it's matir, and they're right up to the permitter. So then we need another drasha for the blood. But if you get rid of the wood, then you have blood, then the word mincha really comes for nothing. And the braita never goes back and says, well, then what does mincha exclude? So the Gemara says, apik eitzim, and that's the very top of our daf, which we finished up with in yesterday's daf, get rid of wood, put in libations, meaning wine. So now we have it like this. The first section says wine and blood is excluded from the word mincha. Then it kind of corrected and said, well, mincha wouldn't necessarily exclude blood because it's actually similar to mincha, because it's a matir, it's a permitter. So then we have me'al minchatcha, which comes to exclude blood. So first section is really mincha is excluding wine, blood, me'al minchatcha is excluding blood. That seems to work. Now they bring a braita, and we're going to get a little off on a tangent to prove that that wine is actually not salted. Ditanya, as it says in a braita, aval hayayim v'hadam v'haitzim v'aktoret ein tu'unim melach. Okay, but wine, here you have it. That's why we brought this braita. Wine doesn't need salting. Okay, what's the problem with this braita, though? You might have figured out the issue. Right now, we just said get rid of wood. Wood actually needs salting according to Rebbi, right? And incense was on the original list in the braita of the things that do need salting. So now the Gemara is going to say, Mari, this braita matches nobody. Rebbi kashi etzim. If it's Rebbi, well, it says wood doesn't need salting, and Rebbi said wood does need salting. Rabbanan, now here it's a little tricky, because where do we know that incense needs salting? From the braita. Now we established on the previous Amud, that on Kaf Amud Bet, that the braita is Rebbi's opinion. And in there it says that incense needs salting. But they're assuming that when Rebbi disagrees about the wood, that's the only thing they really disagree about. And the rabbis must agree with Rebbi about the incense. So now we have Rebbi's position, which is wood is not on this list, so the braita doesn't match him. And the fact that incense doesn't need salting, that goes against the rabbis, which is the mainstream position, which is incense is one of those items that actually needs salting. Remember the criteria in the braita? It's the only part I didn't review in the braita, which is in the end, the way the Gemara understood the braita is there's a klal upratu klal, meaning general, specific, general. Whatever's like the mincha, in what sense? What do we define it as? It's mincha is something that achirim ba'im chovala, and then we said also it's a matir, it's a permitter, and other things are needed before it. Like we need wood, otherwise you can't, right? And that's wood needed for the incense, is needed for all those things. So, Rabbanan kasha ketoret. The ketoret doesn't belong on the list. So now they're going to bring a third opinion. Until now there was Rebbi, the rabbis, who really only disagreed about the wood. Now we're going to have Hai Tana. It must be this Tana. De Tanya, as it says in a braita, Rabbi Yishmael ben Rabbi Yochanan ben Beroka. Okay, comes up in a lot of braitot. He's Rabbi Yishmael, the son of Rabbi Yochanan ben Beroka, not Rabbi Yishmael and Rabbi Akiva, who argue all the time. A different Rabbi Yishmael says, and he's going to basically agree that there's this klal upratu klal. It's just a matter of what typifies a mincha. In the braita, we have one opinion. He's going to have a different list of things that typify a mincha. And then we're going to actually exclude incense from the list. And we're going to exclude the wood. All the four things are going to match up perfectly. Mahaprat mifurash davar shemekabel tumah. So number one, what's a mincha? It's something that's susceptible to impurity. What's susceptible to impurity? Food and drink, humans, okay, could be susceptible to impurity, and, oh my God, it's eluding me right now. Food, drink, vessels, obviously. Okay, now, olel ishim goes on a flame. Okay, so first of all, mincha's food, so it goes in, it's makabel tuma. Olel ishim, it gets burned. Yeshno amizbech hachitzon, and it's brought on the outer altar. So now here we're going to come. Av kol davar shemekabel tumah olel ishim v'yeshno amizbech hachitzon. So those are the criteria to determine whether something needs salt, just like the mincha, because remember, pasuk about salting was all about the mincha. Yatzu eitzim. Okay, wood is out. Why is wood out? She'eino mekablim tumah. It's not food. It's not a vessel. Okay, like a log, right? Not a vessel. It doesn't accept anything in it. And it's not, right? And it's not, that's already out, okay? Yatzu dam v'yayin she'en olim li'ishim. Blood and wine are out because they're not burned on the altar. And yatzak ketoret, why ketoret? Incense, she'en al mizbeach hachitzon. because it's offered on the inner altar. So that's this other opinion, and we got to that only really because we brought the braita to prove what we did in yesterday's daf of basically getting rid of the wood and in place of it putting the libations. Again, we had to get rid of the wood because it didn't match Rebbi. We had to include something because otherwise it didn't make sense. The first two sections have two different psukim to get rid of blood. It makes no sense. The first word, mincha, the first drasha, the braita must be excluding something, so it must be, we're going to add wine to the list. And then we brought this braita that also, by the way, had ketoret, which theoretically you could have added ketoret also at this point. But now we just wanted to know who's the author of the braita. Now we go back to the blood. The blood is excluded from the words ma'al menchatcha. Now the Gemara says, you really didn't need a drasha to exclude blood. It's obvious that you don't salt blood. Why? We're going to see right now. Elatama demiate kra ledam, right? So the whole reason why dam does not get salted, according to what we've learned so far, is because there's a drasha in the pasuk, which means that halav hachi, without the drasha, hava amin, I would have thought dam libai melach, dam needs salting. No way, no how. Kevan demalche napik lemi Torah dam. If you salt blood, it's no longer blood that can go on the altar. And that would be why we don't salt blood, because it ruins the blood from going on the altar. Okay, where do we get this from? Ta'amar Ze'eri, Amar Rabbi Chanina. Ze'eri said in the name of Rabbi Chanina. Now, the first thing before we read this, you have to understand. The blood, there's two things very important about blood in the Torah. One is it goes on the altar, and that's the main way you get atonement, from the sprinkling of the blood. We've seen a lot of that over the last two Masechtot. The second thing is you're not allowed to eat blood. Why not? Because it is the way we atone for our sins with the animal's blood, so you're not allowed to eat blood. It says so explicitly in the psukim. In the psukim, where it talks about the fact that you can't eat blood, it connects it to the fact that blood is used as korbanot. Now, the same thing, even though it's not said explicitly, by chelev. Remember, the chelev is the fatty parts of the animal that go on the altar, and those are specifically the parts you're not allowed to eat. And I always say this, so you remember it. That's why we know that chelev is only forbidden for behemot and nachayot, for domesticated and not non-domesticated animals. Because non-domesticated animals don't go on the altar. Okay, so therefore their chelev is not forbidden. So there's a direct correlation between what's forbidden to eat when it comes to blood and chelev and what can go on the altar. If it can't go on the altar, then it's actually not forbidden to eat. Okay, so that's what we're going to say right now. Amar Ze'eri, Amar Rabbi Chanina. We're going to have two statements of Ze'eri. One he quotes Rabbi Chanina, and one Rav Yehuda quotes Ze'eri, but it's both Ze'eri. Dam shebishlo eino over belav. Blood that you cooked, it's not a lo taseh. Okay, now, if it's cooked, okay, it's already changed its form. Because it's changed its form, and it's already, what happens to it? It coagulates, it gets thicker. That blood is not valid to go on the altar, and therefore you're not liable to get curry for it. Most of the commentaries say it's forbidden anyway. Some say by rabbinic law, some say even by Torah law, it's just not curry. It's not like you can go ahead and eat blood, okay, that you cooked. But the fact is, it can't go on the altar, that's for sure. For Rabbi Yehuda Amar Ze'eri, dam shemilcho eino over alav. Also blood that was salted. Because salt, now salt creates chemical reactions, we know from chemistry. It also, in halacha, perhaps because of that, it's called maliach hareu kiroteach. Salting is like cooking, okay? Like if you pickle something, it's like cooking it. So it's an issue for Shabbat, it's an issue for kashrut issues and certain things. So it's treated like cooking. So now, that's why we connect these two, okay? Salting is like cooking, basically, and therefore it's invalid. Okay, so number one, you're not going to be liable, kare, but that really means for our purposes, invalid to go on the altar. So, of course, that's the reason why you don't salt blood, because if you salted the blood, it would ruin it, and then you couldn't put it on the altar. Okay, so that's our question. Before we get to the answer, we have one more thing, since they're already quoting all these statements. So Rabbi Yehuda quoted Ze'eri in the second one, and now they say Rabbi Yehuda Didei. Rabbi Yehuda himself said something else, which is somewhat similar, although it's a little different, but somewhat similar, because what it means is Evarim, if you take the parts that are supposed to be burned on the altar, the parts of the body, the limbs, Shetz La'an, if you roasted them first, which is similar to cooking them first or salting them first of the blood, there isn't reach nichach. Now that's for a bit of a different reason, because we said it takes out that beautiful smell when you're barbecuing. That's the great smell. If you barbecue it before and then put it on the altar, you're not going to have that beautiful smell. But it's the same kind of idea of doing some process to it before it goes on the altar. Okay, but that's not really important for our purposes. So now they're going to explain why we needed a drasha anyway. Because when we say salting is like cooking and it changes the form, that's obviously if we put a lot of salt on it. Okay? But ma'u detema mishtaba mashu lemitzvah ba'alma kamash malan. You might have thought maybe we put a teeny bit of salt just to be yotze. We need to put salt on your korbanot. It says it, so put a little bit of salt. It's not going to change the form of the blood, right? Then maybe you would have thought that needs to be done to fulfill the mitzvah, and it won't disqualify it for the altar. That's why you needed a drasha to say so. Okay, so we resolved that issue. But since we quoted this, we're going to go in depth about this, and we're going to go gufa. Gufa is one of these, link into this topic. Let's learn it more in depth. So now we're going to talk about the blood that's cooked and coagulates and changes form. It's going to be a bit of a chemistry lesson, although not from the perspective of chemistry. Amar ze'eri amar Rabbi Chanina. Dam shebishlo oneo over alav. So Yativ Rava v'ka'amar la lahashmata. So Rava went and taught what Ze'eri said. Now remember, Rava is going to appear at the end of the sugya with a different opinion. But right now he's quoting Ze'eri in the Beit Midrash. Abaye hears, or I don't know if they were really in the same Beit Midrash, according to Beni Lav, they never really learned in the same Beit Midrash, but somehow Abaye got wind of what Rava said, and Eitive Abaye questions and says, Hikpa et adam va'achalo. If you coagulate the blood and eat it, okay, it gets to a more solid form, and you eat it, shimchat hachelev ugamao, or with the chelev, you actually, okay, this is why it sounds like chemistry, right? You're turning something from liquid to solid or solid to liquid. So you take the fat that's a solid and you turn it into a liquid. You boil it up or something and it's liquidy, and you eat it, chayav. So he says you are obligated. The issur of eating chelev, the issur of eating dam, is even if the blood became thicker and solid form. So how could you say if you cook the blood, right? The word I saw in the Koran was to curdle the blood. Okay, if you curdle the blood, which I tried to look up exactly curdle, because curdling could be with cooking. It's not necessarily with cooking. Okay, something could curdle, right? Milk could curdle by spoiling. So okay. Anyway, it's not clear if you used heat or not, but we're going to see now they did think they used heat. So it seems to completely contradict. So Rava says, I have a resolution. Lo kasha. Kan shikpa be'ol, kan shikpa b'chama. Well, one you curdled it with a fire, and one you curdled it with the sun. Okay, both heating it, although I guess you could say theoretically, right, it's just leaving it out in the sun, maybe not heating it, like milk would curdle if you left it for too long and in warm weather. So maybe even that means like that. Okay, so one you did it with the fire, and one you did it with the sun, with heat from the sun. What's the difference? Be'or lo hada. If you boil up the milk with a fire and it thickens, it's not going to ever go back to its original form. But bechama hadal. But if it warms up by the sun and curdles as a result of the heat of the sun, it actually will go back to its original state. Since it'll go back to its original state, we'll say it's forbidden to eat. That's the one that said it's forbidden to eat, the braita. Why? Because theoretically, and now we're going to have a difficulty with this, you could offer it on the altar because it's going to go back to being liquid. And once it's liquid, you can put it on the altar. So now Abaye says, what are you talking about? He says, but wait, for that moment that it had curdled, you can't put it on the altar. Now, didn't we learn already? Remember the whole thing of nidche? If something can't go on the altar for a moment or for half an hour or an hour or two, okay, that's it. It's rejected from the altar temporarily. It's rejected forever. So Abaye, it's actually interesting. Abaye brought this difficulty on Rava. Okay, Rava now answers it. This is the interesting part. I'll get to it after what happens. It gets a little confusing, but that's why I want to track it right now. Abaye asked the difficulty on Rava. Rava resolved it. Abaye says that's not a good resolution. Okay? What's interesting about it is Abaye is supporting something that goes against the braita he brought, which is you shouldn't be chayiv. That's where it gets a little interesting and a little tricky in terms of thinking here, because in the end, Abaye is saying your answer is no good, which basically means his question is intact, but the content of his answer is once it's rejected, and then it should be permitted. And he brought this braita that said that curdled blood is actually forbidden on the altar. So that's a bit of a question, but we'll deal with that in a minute. How does he know that once it's rejected, it's rejected? Besides that, we've learned this halach of nidche. But he quotes this question that Rabbi Meni asked Rabbi Yochanan. Dehaba mine Rabbi Meni me Rabbi Yochanan. He asked him the following question: Dam shekarash ve'achalo, okay, blood that coagulated and it was eaten. Mahu amarle ho'il v'nitcha yidacheh. Since it was rejected, it would be rejected forever, and it can never go on the altar, which means you're not obligated for eating it. This is where it gets tricky, because then that really goes against what Abaye himself said. So Abaye is using this. This is why I want to clarify. Abaye is using this just to reject Rava's answer. In a minute, Abaye is going to resolve the issue with the braita in a different way. And he brought the difficulty with the braita, where you do see this source that says you're actually obligated. So right now, he seems to be saying you're not obligated, even if it'll go back to its original form, because at that moment, it was disqualified. So Ishtik, Rava was silent. He said, you're right, I really have no good answer, okay? My resolution of differentiating between sunlight and the heat of the sun, sorry, not the light, but the heat of the sun and the heat of fire is not a good distinction. So Amarle, but now comes Abaye and he says, Dilma Vadai, maybe for sure. Okay, that's a very weird way of saying it. What do you mean, maybe for sure? So first of all, this happened yesterday. I wish I could remember exactly how she said it. It was Shabbat. I couldn't write it down, but my daughter said exactly a statement just like that. She said, something like, maybe this is for sure the way it should be done. I don't remember what it was, but it was something like that, where, sometimes you talk like that, because what it's saying is perhaps here's a good answer, and I'm pretty convinced of it. The box says get rid of the word vadai. It doesn't belong here, and then that's an easier way. Maybe, and here's the suggestion, kam b'chata'ot ha'chitzoniyot, kam b'chata'ot ha'pnimiyot. You can differentiate between blood that's supposed to go on the inner altar and blood that's supposed to go on the outer altar. How so? So we'll see in a minute. But before he explains himself, or I don't know, maybe he wasn't going to explain himself, Rava comes and responds. We have this nice interaction, Abaye, Rava. Okay, first, Abaye brings contradiction to Rava. While he rejects Rava's resolution, he actually then resolves the problem himself. And once he does that, Rava says, oh, I got something to support what you're going to say. So, Rava says, Ad kartan milta, you reminded me now of something that Amar Rav Chisda, that Rav Chisda taught me. Dam shekarash b'chata'ot hachitzoniyot va'achalo chayav. If it coagulates, and it's something that was supposed to go on the outer altar, and then you eat it, you're obligated. Why? Because you could have brought it on the outer altar. Why? V'lakach v'natana marachmana. It says you should take and you should put. Now, hi bar l'kichau nitinai. Okay, you're not going to really understand where they're going until you see the next one. But we say basically, I can take something solid, I can take something liquid. Where do we get this whole concept that blood has to be liquid? There's no issue. It doesn't have to be liquid. Okay? You can just take solid blood and put it on the altar. It needs placing on the altar. Maybe you know where he's going now. Why, if it's the chata'ot pnimiyot, if you eat it and it's solid, you're exempt. Because, right, again, you have to remember, we're talking about the issue of blood, the issue of eating it, if it was supposed to go on the inner altar or the outer altar. That's the case here. Okay? Vitaval vihiza amar rachmana. It says you have to dip and sprinkle. Now, you can't dip into something solid. Bahai lav bar tefila v'haza'au. Okay, this is not something you can dip your finger into. Okay, another from yesterday. We were at a kiddush and there were macaroons, and my daughter opened the macaroon and stuck her finger in the part in the middle of the two macaroons, which is kind of solid. I would think it would be like coagulated blood. And she stuck her finger in and, ate it like that. And I was thinking, you have like dipping your finger into something solid. You actually could do it. But anyway, here the Gemara seems to say you can't. You have to do an experiment with blood and see how solid it can actually get. That would be the chemistry lesson here. Anyway, he differentiates. So now let's go back. Ze'eri, who said you're not chayav, would be talking about dam and the chata'ot pnimiyot. If it was solid, it's not right way for the mizbeach, can't go on the altar, and therefore you're not liable karet if you eat it. But on the chata'ot chitzoniyot, where you could put it in its solid form, you're going to be liable in its solid form. Okay. Now, Rava, so that's the end of this discussion between Rava and Abaye about what Ze'eri said when Rava brought Ze'eri's halacha to the Beit Midrash, which again, or to somewhere where he was meeting Abaye, and he said, dam that's cooked, you're not over alav. Now, Rava Didei Amar, afilu b'chata'ot ha'pnimiyot v'achalo chayav, ho'il u'kenegdo ra'oi b'chata'ot ha'chitzoniyot. But Rava himself said that even the chata'ot pnimiyot, if you eat it, you're going to be liable karet. Why? Because It's parallel. If it were supposed to be on the chatat, you can imagine. You could get confused. Who knew whether it was supposed to be on the chatat chitzoni or the chatat pnimi, right? If this is what we call a gzeira, forbid it because since if it were brought on the chatat chitzoni and on the mizbeach chitzoni, the outer one, it would have been a problem and it would have worked in the mizbeach in its solid form, and therefore if I eat it, I'm obligated. So let's forbid the pnimiyot ones of my blood that was supposed to be brought on the inner altar as well. And comes Rav Papa after Rava says this. I'm Rav Papa Hilkach. From what you're saying, I'm going to take this even farther. Hilkach dam chamor, the dam of a donkey. Now you can't bring a donkey as a sacrifice. The blood of a donkey, theoretically, you would say shekarash, right? That the coagulated, since you can't bring it on the altar, right? V'achalo, he says you're chayav anyway, right? You might say since it can't go on the altar, you could eat it. No. You can be chayav for that, and we know, like all blood of animals is forbidden, not just the blood of animals that can go on the altar, okay, as opposed to what I said about the chaylev, where the chaylev is really clearly from the Torah, it's only animals that can go on the altar. Even though the blood is saying because it goes on the altar, it applies to all animals, and here you see Rav Papa say it, because if it wasn't a donkey, but it was blood of a sheep, it would be a problem. So it could go on the inner altar and therefore would be forbidden. So we forbid that as well. Okay, that was a complete tangent into this thing about blood that was cooked and changed its form to a solid. Now we go back to one other thing about blood, and then we're going to go back to salting in general and learn about rules of salting. Amar Rav Gidol Amar Ziri. So again, we have Ziri quoted here. Dam ben lach ben yavesh chotzetz. Okay, blood, whether it's solid or liquid, it's still going to be a chatzitza, like in a mikveh. If you have blood on your body when you go in the mikveh, it's a problem. Meitive, they say, wait, contradiction. It says in a braita, hadam vadio vadvash v'chalav yiveshin chotzitzim lachin enam chotzitzim. Take all these substances, blood, ink, honey, and milk. All of those things, if they're dry, they're a chatzitza. Okay, if they're dried on your skin, but if they're liquidy, they're not, because what happens with a liquid, right? You have milk on your body, and you go in the mikveh, the milk comes right off. So how could you say ben lach ben yavesh? It's a chatzitza. Lo kasha had a srich, had a lo srich. It depends as it's sticky, right? There's a difference between solid, right? You could have liquid, but it's sticky. If it's a little thicker and stuck on your skin, then it's obviously going to be a chatzitza, and if not, not. Now we get to this question, which really leads us to this long braita, teaches you all about salting. The pasuk says, "Kol korban minchatcha," which we darshaned already, b'melach timlach. Okay, the korban of your mincha. That was where we darshaned the word mincha to exclude the wood or the libations. B'melach timlach. In salt, you should salt it. Okay, that's obviously repetitive to say salt it, right? Why do you have to say both? So timlach l'mayata. Why does it say once it says b'melach? Why does it say timlach? Or you could say the reverse. Once it says timlach, why say b'melach? So they say l'chidetanya for the following braita. B'melach, if it just said melach, yachol tivonehu. You would have thought, okay, we don't know what tivonehu is, so we're going to leave this for right now. You might have thought something, which we're going to have three different possibilities about what it means. Talmud Lomar, that's why it says timlach, to exclude this possibility. Okay, we're going to have to just know that we don't understand this right now. We'll come back to this. E timlach, wait, if you just said timlach, yachol b'mei melach, you might have thought I could use salt water. Talmud Lomar b'melach. That's why it says with salt, not salt water, with salt. Lo tashbit melach, that's the next words. Don't, okay, tashbit is to have it stop. Okay, we don't know what this means exactly. Have melach she'ena shovetet. This means the ideal melach you should bring is the one that's always there. There's a bit of a question what exactly this means, but we'll explain right now. Ve'ezos melach stomit. Okay, the sodomite salt is always there because it's in the water and the water washes it up on the shore and you can get it from the ground there very easily. It's just accessible always. And it's always, always there. Okay, now we don't really know what this is. Commentaries say it's salt that was mined from the ground. Now, why is that not the same as the one in the water? So either because humans have to do it and humans don't work 24/7, like they'll work during the day and not at night, or right nowadays, maybe it's a little different, but still people don't work all through the night. Some people say there's certain seasons where you can't do it because the weather's bad, or, it's not like it's always there, whereas the melech stomit is always there. However you define it, they just differentiate between this. Strokanit seems to be perhaps from a place called that. Talmud Lomar, takriv. So because it says takriv, so in other words, ideally use the one that's ena shovetet. But if you can't find that, so you can use istrokni, Talmud Lomar, takriv. Takriv kolshu. Okay, we're going to have 4 drashot on this. Takriv mikol makom, meaning any way you have salt, you can use it. So that's where we get the istrok need. But the first one is even a little bit of salt works. Takriv afilu b'Shabbat. You're allowed to do avodah and korbanot on Shabbat. But you might have thought maybe not salting though. Maybe it's not as important. No, even on Shabbat you do it. Takriv afilu b'tuma, even in tuma, even if you're impure. Okay, you might have thought, right, when tuma is permitted in impurity, tuma hutru b'tzibur, so maybe we allow the main things, but avoid doing too many things. So maybe don't do salt. No, you do it as well. That's what we learned from the word takriv. Okay, now we have to go back and say, my tivonehu. What was this word? We didn't know what it meant. Yachol tivonehu, and then it said no. It says mela, timlach, to exclude that possibility. So amar ula hachikama. So the first explanation, I told you we're going to have 3. Yachol yitbonenu ketevin betit. Maybe you have to put a ton of it, the way you put straw into clay to make bricks. Amar Abaye, no, yitbonenu mebayale. It should have said yitbonenu, not tivonehu. Maybe you have to make it like a house. You have to build it, like put a lot of salt all around on top of the sacrifice or on top of whatever it is you're doing it on. It should have said yivnenu, not tivoneu. Ela amar Rava yachol tivunehu. Okay, so that didn't help us. My tivunehu. Amar Ravashi yachol yitem bo tam kibina. Maybe you have to give it enough taste, like the way people have bina in they have wisdom in them, which gives it taste, like it changes who you are, your wisdom. So, an interesting theory here. Tamalomar timlach. So from there they say, no, timlach, you just have to put some salt. You don't need that amount. Okay, it doesn't need to change the taste of it. Okay, we continue on. This seems to be a break in the braita to explain that. Now we go back. How do you do it? You take the piece of meat, you put the salt on it, turn it upside down, put salt on, and then put it on the altar. Same thing, by the way, this is how you kosher meat. Okay, you do it in the same way. You put on one side, you put on the other side. Okay, and that's what he says. Now, he says liktera. Ktera is for cooking. But Tosfot quotes that there's a girsa here. This is just super interesting. V'chein litzli, same thing for roasting, okay, like for barbecuing. Now, we know that generally you don't have to put salt if you're going to barbecue something, because what's the point of salting? To take out the blood. The blood comes out when you put it on the barbecue. So there's this big debate here in the girsa. Do you need to also do that for roasting or not? Okay, and that's just a side point. We're going to move on. Turning now to Amabed, Tanu Rabbanan, another braita today. We have a lot of braitot. Melach al gabei ha'ever mo'alimbo. If it's still on the piece of meat, that salt has a law of me'ila, meaning it's consecrated right now because you haven't yet burned it. And now it's become sacred because you put it on the meat and it hasn't been used for its mitzvah yet. Sha'al gabei ha'kevesh b'shebach roshosha mizbeach. Now we're going to learn later that they would put the salt on either on the ram for the piece of meat or on the top of the altar. Now, the assumption is if there's salt there, it must be it fell off. Okay, now if it falls off, you can't use it for the mitzvah anymore, so ein mo'alimbo, it no longer has a lot of mi'ila. Amar Rav Matna, which again is misuse of consecrated property. Amar Rav Matna, Mikra, where do we get this from? The first one, that if it's on the aver, it's still mi'ila. It's going to be sacred right now. So they slaughtered before God. The kohanim put on its salt, v'he'elu otam ola l'Hashem, and then they offer it as an ola to God. Here you see, with the salt on it, it's called an ola, so therefore it's obviously sacred. And if you would use the salt, let's say you take some salt off and use it, it would be misuse of consecrated property. Okay, from here to the end of the daf, we're going to be dealing with this Mishnah in Shkalim. The Mishnah in Shkalim says, and interestingly, they don't quote the beginning, which is hit new beitin. The beitin made a t'nai. This is going to be important later on. The beitin came and stipulated, basically, it's like they made a takana. They said, listen, the salt and the wood in the temple, the kohanim are allowed to benefit from that. Okay, this is fascinating sugya in terms of, you work in an office and they have stuff there. You're allowed to use it. For what purpose are you allowed to use it? Their pens, can you take them home, use them in your house, not for work purposes, right? This is like a really good sugya about this. So Shmuel says, okay, what does it mean the kohanim can use it? Can they take it home and put it on their food at home? It's remember, what was the salt bought from? The machatzira shekel. It was from all the money that everybody gave for communal offerings. So how are they using the salt for their own purposes? So comes Shmuel and says, and it's going to be a big debate about what Shmuel means by what he says. Lo shanu ela korbanam, aval la'achila lo. It's just for their korbanot, but not for eating. Okay, seems simple. What does he seem to be saying? Kasal kadatin. At first, we think that what does he mean here? My korbanam limloach korbanam, to salt their sacrifices. So, right, they have to salt sacrifices. You can use the tzibur, right, the money from the machatzit, the shekel, the salt from the temple. You can use for salting. But la'achila is la'achilat kodashim. And what can't they use it for? Obviously, they can't use it for going home. What it means they can't use it for is they can't use it for eating when they, remember, the Kohanim ate all this meat in the Azarah. Well, they can't take salt from there for the Azarah. Okay, that they're not allowed to do for their own sacrifices. Hashta limloch or so now they say that doesn't make any sense though, because hashta limloch orot kodashim yahavinan la'achila kodashim lo yahavinan. To say that they can't use it for their salting their meat doesn't make any sense, because they're allowed to use the salt in the temple, and we'll see in a minute how we know this, for salting the hides. The Kohanim got the hides, and if they didn't salt it, they would get ruined. So they were allowed to salt the hides, and we're going to see in a minute where they would do that. And therefore, if they could salt their hides with the salt in the temple, they should be able to salt their meat with it as well. What's the difference? Salt their hides, which is completely for their own personal use. Also, the eating of the meat was for their own personal use. Ditanya. Nimtzeta taumil. Now they're going to tell you there were 3 places in the temple where the salt was brought. Okay, I'm going to bring up the picture right now of the temple, and we're going to see exactly where this place is, because there's nothing like seeing. Okay, so there were 3 places that had the salt. Okay, number 1, Lishkat HaMelech. Okay, this is the salt chamber. Okay, the salting chamber, they call it here. I'm going to circle it. Okay, it's right here. So where is that if you're not looking at the map? So when you walk into Shar Nikanor, there's the first little strip that you get to is called the Ezrat Yisrael, the Israelite courtyard where people could go. Anyway, if you make a left there, which is actually to the south side, so you make a left, you go in, and right in the end of the room, okay, against the southern wall, is the salting chamber. Okay, that was what it was. Okay, we're going to see in a minute what they would do there. And the other, okay, so now this is what they're telling you in this braita is, where did they have the salt stored? So one was in the salting chamber, which makes perfect sense, okay? One was on the ramp, ala kevesh, and one was berosh mizbeach, on the top of the altar. Okay, those are the 3 places where they had salt. Okay, now why? Now here you have it. Shesham mochim orot kodashim. They would keep the salt there because they would salt the hides right there. That means they would salt the hides with the salt of the temple. Okay, so there you have your answer. Okay, or that's your question, basically. So if they were able to use it for that, then they should be able to use it for eating their sacrifices as well. It's all personal use of the Kohanim. Anyway, let's just continue in this braita to finish it. Al gabei kevesh shesham mochim tevarim. That's where they would salt the body parts of that they would bring of the korban tamid that get burned on the altar. And berosh mizbeach shesham mochim hakometz halavona ktoret minchat kohanim minchat kohen mashiach minchat nisachim ve'olat ha'of. Okay, that's where they would salt all the parts that they burn on the altar. Okay, which I don't have to go through the list again. We've seen them before. Okay, so that's okay. And then umay la'achila. So elamay lekorbanam. So then, what does lekorbanam mean? Lekorbanam must mean la'achilat korbanam. Okay, it must mean lekorbanam means for eating the korbanot. Umay la'achila, and what is they can't use it for? La'achilat dechulin, for eating anything they want that's not kodesh. Okay, Gemara says, chulin pshita. They obviously can't take salt from the temple and take it home and go eat chulin or take it outside the Azara. That's a ridiculous thing to explain it that way. Okay, so option 2 now doesn't make much sense. So my ba'u hatam, right? What are they doing with it? With chulin stuff. The salt is obviously in the temple area. Afagav da'amar mar yochlu shichlu im chulin utruma kadeshin echelet ala sofa afilu hachi melech de kodeshim lo yahavina. Look what they say. This is what they want to tell you. The pasuk in Bamidbar Yudchet, pasuk Chet says, Hashem says to Aaron, I gave you all these Kohen gifts, okay, meaning all the things, and the Chokot B'nai Israel, all these sacrifices of the Jewish people go to you, you get to eat the meat. Limoshcha. Limoshcha is from the word to anoint. It's like a word of kings, to eat it like kings. Now, if you eat a mincha, okay, for those who went to the workshop, you know it's not so big. So you eat the remainders of the mincha, right? How much do you have? Not so much. You're not exactly satiated. Well, that's not a nice meal. So they would feed them other food before. They would eat other foods to be satiated, so that they would be able to eat it. They would be satiated when they finish the mincha. So they would bring chulin and truma items, which is the food the kohanim would eat their truma. So they would eat it ala sova, so they were satiated. So you might have thought those are for the purpose of the mincha, of eating it properly. Maybe you could salt it. We're not talking about regular chulin bringing it home. We're talking about the things that we eat just before. Maybe you could do that. That's what we're talking about. Okay, so now we're up to option 2, which is when Shmuel says lekorbanan, it means eating their korbanot. When it says not lo'achlan, though, not for eating chulin. Like, for example, this kind of chulin. And Amar le Ravina le Ravashi achinam mistaber. I'm going to further prove this second reading. Yeah, and yes, like the korban pesach, exactly. To eat, right, it had to be eaten ala sova, and they would bring other meat, same thing. So he says, the isa kadatach my le korbanam limloach. If you thought it was to salt their korbanot, which is what we thought originally, that makes no sense to have a drasha for that. Why? Well, tama da'atne beitin. Now remember what this Mishnah said in Shkalim. The Mishnah said it's a t'nai beitin, right? The beitin says the kohanim can use it. Now, if the beitin came and said the kohanim can use the salt to salt their korbanot, makes no sense. They could salt their korbanot even without the beitin having instituted that, because halo atne beitin lo. What if they hadn't done that? We wouldn't have been allowed to. Hashtal Yisrael Yavina on the Kohanim lo Yavina. Now it's clear, and we're going to see in a minute how we know it's clear, that regular Israelites who brought a korban and it needed salting, it would come from the salt. Okay, and that we kind of saw before already, but now we're going to see it even more. Titania Yachol HaOmer Harei Alai Mincha Yavim. Okay, we're going to have a bit of a dizzying logic here. Again, the logic's not going to win out. We're going to have to bring a pasuk, but we're going to basically prove that for Yisraelim, the melach, the salt, came from the temple treasury. If it came from the temple treasury for the regular Israelites, of course it would come from the Kohanim, and of course you wouldn't need the Beit Din to come and stipulate that. It was obvious. So that's going to further prove option 2, that it wasn't to salt their korbanot. So now we're going to go through this back and forth. You might have thought someone says Harei Alai Mincha, and we're talking about Israelites now. Yavi melach mitoch beito. Maybe you should bring salt from home for the salting of it. Kederach shemivi levona mitoch beito. And they bring a paradigm for it, like the levona. If I bring a mincha, I have to bring my own levona with it, the frankincense. Vidinu, it would be logical to say, because ne'amar havei mincha v'havei melach. It says bring a mincha and bring salt on it. And it also says, these aren't psukim, this are just, the Torah says you should do this. And it also says bring a mincha. When you bring a mincha, you have to bring levona with it. So you can learn one from the other. Just like the frankincense you have to bring from home, also the salt. Oh, maybe you could say the opposite logic. Okay, just like we said, bring a mincha and bring salt with it. Also, what else do you need to bring a mincha? You need wood first. You need a fire. Now, the fire is used from public funds. Af melach mishal tzibur. So also, the salt is from public funds. Nir elami domeh. So right now we said it could be this, it could be that. How do we know? Well, let's try to see which it's more similar to. It's going to be ABBA. Okay? So it says, now we're going to say, danin davar hanoheg b'cholas v'chim. We're going to learn something that's in all korbanot. Mi davar hanoheg b'cholas v'chim. You need salt for all your korbanot. And you need wood for all your korbanot. So it would be logical, actually, to say the second option, which is you have to bring it. You can use the public funds. Whereas levona isn't in all sacrifices. It's not even in all menachot. Or maybe go back to levona and saying you have to bring it from home. The levona and the salt all go in the same kli as the mincha. But al yochichu etzim, wood doesn't go in the same vessel as it. So logic gets you nowhere. You can prove this way, you can prove that way. Talmud lomar, that's why the pasuk says, Brit melech olam hu, ulahalanu omil me'et b'nei Yisrael brit olam. Okay, it says by salt, it's a covenant with God forever. We saw this pasuk before. And it also uses that language by the lechem apanim. Ma lahalana, the lechem apanim is for sure mishal tzibur, ab ka mishal tzibur. Okay, so right now, we're explaining Shmuel, the second option. And we further proved it, that it's to salt. It's not to salt your kodashim, because that's obvious. And that would be before the Beit Din came stipulated. So what the Beit Din must have stipulated was something additional. They can even use it for eating. What they can't use it for is eating chulin, even for the sake of their sacrifice. But for eating their sacrifices, they can use salt. But comes, and we're not going to finish this today, Amar Rav Mordechai Ravashi, Hachik Amar Rav Shisha Bered Rav Idi, Lo Nitzcha Ela Leben Buchri. He's going to go back to option 1. where you have to salt your kodashim. Okay, and the Kohanim, what the Beit Din said is, you can salt your kodashim with the salt of the temple. Even though for the Israelites it's obvious, it's not as obvious for the Kohanim, and you're going to have to wait till tomorrow to figure this out. But it's specifically according to Ben Bukhri. So right now, forget exactly why we're bringing this. We're just going to learn Ben Bukhri. Ditnan Amar Rabbi Yehuda Ben Bukhri beyavne. He explained that Kol Kohen sheshokel eno chotei. Any Kohen who gives the machatzit shekel is not a sinner, meaning he doesn't have to, but he can if he wants. And there's nothing wrong with it. Amar Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai lo. Anyone who doesn't give the machatzit shekel is a sinner. Ela shakohanim doshim mikra ze lasman. It's Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai says Kohanim have to bring, and then they point out that the Kohanim would make this drasha and try to convince themselves that they didn't need to bring the machatzit shekel, and they would say the following: Kol minchat kohen kalil tiyeh lo teachel. Any mincha b'kohen has to be completely burnt. So what they say, here are 3 communal offerings that will be brought with the machatzit shekel. If the Kohanim pay in, then it means it's owned by Israelites and Kohanim. Now, if it's owned by Kohanim, what happens to it? Shalanuhu, right? It'll be ours. And how then would it be able to be burned? So we better not pay the machatzit shekel, so that these minchas aren't considered Kohen offerings. They have to be completely burned because people eat them, right? They're given to be eaten. So basically, that's what this braita says. We're going to stop here for today, and then we're going to ask a question on Ben Bukhri, and then we're going to try to figure out how this has to do with a different way to explain Shmuel, and how to explain Shmuel back to the first reading that we had, which was more the simple reading of Shmuel. Okay, so what we did today was we finished up with this braita about the different things in the braita that didn't make sense to us. Once we brought Nesachim, we then brought a braita that says, okay, so it's libations, and here we have a braita. Then we said, oh, that braita doesn't seem to match any of the opinions we saw before. It's a third opinion. Then we went into why did they even think that blood was in? Isn't blood ruined and obviously can't go on the altar as soon as you add salt to it? We said, well, that's a little versus a lot, right? A lot would definitely disqualify it. A little might be okay, and therefore maybe you have to do a little, and that's why it has to teach us, no, you don't have to. Then we went in depth into this whole thing about salt and cooking, changing the form of the blood, and whether you're actually obligated on can't eat blood, and whether it would go on the altar, which go hand in hand. And then from there we got to, is blood a chatzitza or not, if it's in a solid form or liquid form, right? Then we got to the rich drashot on the psukim about melach, which really taught us all the details about how to salt. And from there we got to when is there me'ila in salting. And then from there we got to this issue about the Mishnah, about what the T'nai Beit Din was. Shmuel said, yes, the Kohanim can benefit, but what kind of benefit can they get? And from there we had 2 interpretations. Yes, for their sacrifice, not for eating. What did that mean? And we're still in the middle of figuring all that out. With that, we finish for today. Wishing everyone a good day and a Shavuot Tov.